Hi, it's Adam here, and in this episode of The Hypnotist, I'm not going to be doing a hypnosis episode. I'm going to wait until I return to the UK before I start doing some original hypnosis recordings, but it's pretty much 2 days before the start of a new year, and it occurred to me just in recent consultation calls with potential new clients that one of the questions that comes up again and again is the question of, will hypnosis cure me? Will hypnosis fix me? And I thought it was really interesting. So I thought I would just kind of do a very short recording to share my thoughts on this unconscious metaphor that many people have about how their mind works. And one of the key clues to how many people think about let's say mental issues or thinking related problems is this umbrella term that we have in popular society now called mental health. And mental health implies and is sometimes overt about the idea of mental illness. And for most people that are, trained hypnotherapists or understand the power of language, they understand that mental health and mental illness are metaphors. I don't think the general public understand that that's really what's going on. And there is a belief that if you have, let's say, anxiety, or if you have intense stress, or if you have overwhelming emotions, or if you have compulsive thoughts, or if you have let's say, revivification of memories of traumatic moments or intrusive thoughts, that somehow you're sick. And if you believe that you're sick, well, your first port of call is probably going to be to your local doctor. And you have to understand the background of a medical doctor. A doctor has gone to medical school. They've spent at least 5 or 6 years training, and then potentially with additional years in specialist areas. So a doctor looks at the world through the lens of a medical model because that's all their training has lent them to be. So their interpretation of, let's say, someone feeling anxious, they're immediately going to be thinking the way that they would think of if it was a physical ailment. So if someone had a physical ailment, if someone had high blood pressure, they might be thinking of a particular prescription to reduce that blood pressure. Rarely will doctors give indications as to what causes the high blood pressure, and that might be obesity, that might be a diet full of salt, and try and influence, let's say, the lifestyle causes that might be behind the high blood pressure, because they're too busy and all of their training leads them to a cause and effect situation where the quickest thing for them to do and the thing that they're trained to do is to prescribe medication that will be most helpful to alleviate the symptoms of that particular issue. And in many cases that's helpful because the average individual isn't really interested in changing their diet or changing their lifestyle. They just want to take a few tablets and they want the problem to go away. In which case the medical model works for physical ailments. If, however, let's say someone's having a lot of stress at work due to variables outside of their control and they're worried about losing their job, well, a natural human response is to try and solve that problem, to think about that situation and try and come up with solutions. And that can quite often lead to, if you're not in control of those variables, it can lead to this idea of anxiety or constant worry and lack of sleep. Now, if that individual was to go to the doctor and ask the doctor for help with their anxiety, the doctor again is going to be looking at that through the medical model and has a variety of options. Quite often they prescribe antidepressants, Because when someone has heightened levels of anxiety for a prolonged period of time, they tend to be depressed about life because they don't see the future as very positive. So they might be prescribed antidepressants. They might be prescribed SRIs, which inhibit the receptors in the brain. They might be prescribed beta blockers, or various other things. And what quite often happens in an interaction with the doctor, because of the white coat syndrome, where individuals respect the authority of a doctor, quite often belief systems get formed that are permanent. So people can walk away from an interaction with a doctor and not say to themselves, I've got anxiety for a very good reason, and maybe this medication will help in the short term. They can leave that with an identity belief and say, I've got anxiety. Or rather than thinking, well, I'm in a temporarily low mood because of lifestyle circumstances or just kind of general sense of well-being, which may be a very short-term thing, could even be influenced by the weather. They can go away with an identity that I am depressed. And when beliefs get formed at the identity level, that has a positive in the sense that it gives validation to that individual. They no longer feel like they're going crazy. They don't feel like they're going, they have an explanation for this troubling feeling with what's going on. So it's helpful. But the downside is that it can be a trap, because if you buy into an identity, the identity belief quite often doesn't move. And you can find people that still believe that they are depressed, even if they have none of the original symptoms that they went to a doctor with at the point where they were seeking help for a very valid reason. And then what can happen is that it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you believe at the identity level that you're depressed, then quite often you don't do certain things because your behavior is aligned with your belief systems. So, for example, if you believed with 100% certainty that there was someone out there in the world that was paid to assassinate you, okay, if you believed that with 100% certainty, would it influence your behavior? Would you change how you react if there seems like there's a stranger following you? If there was a car with tinted windows, would that make you anxious? The point I'm making is that a belief system is inextricably linked to behavior and emotions. And if you believe you're depressed, or if you believe that you have long-term anxiety at an identity level, that's then going to create the behaviors and the emotions that quite often create this self-fulfilling prophecy that keeps you in that position. Again, the point I'm making is that a doctor is trained to look at the world through the medical model, and they've got limited options as to what they can do. So, for example, in the States, I think it's requires FDA approval. I'm not sure the exact acronym, but I think it's the Federation of Drugs, Federal Drug Administration, I believe. But I'm UK based, and in the UK we have an organisation called NICE, which I believe stands for the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. So here in the UK, the doctors can only prescribe those things that have NICE approval. And NICE approval, because it's an approval body, can only really do it where you have a double-blind studies against a placebo, and therefore it's very difficult to do that with things like therapy, and very simple to do that with pharmaceutical substances, because then you can compare over a control group and get verifiable results. And if that meets a certain requirement over, clinical research trials, then that can get the NICE approval. So if you see a doctor, they're limited in the options they can give you based on what has been approved within their environment. And that can lead to identities that aren't helpful. So you see a doctor, they're looking at it through the medical model. And that's why the majority of the population are looking at issues with how they think and how they feel as a mental health problem, rather than, and there's many other models that could be looked at here, as a learning model. And I personally believe that the brain is very, very powerful and the mind is very, very capable. And if it encounters a situation where you don't have control of how your emotions feel, then the brain and the mind is going to be thinking about ways to avoid that problem from happening. And quite often you get these loops where the very thing it's trying to protect you from increases the probability of that feeling. But the intention behind that is your mind trying to protect you from a problem. So from my perspective, a more useful model to look at, and let's use this term, mental health issues, isn't that you're sick, and it isn't that you're broken, and it isn't that there's something wrong with you. It's just that your brain has learned a strategy that might not be useful. It might not be the most effective strategy. Or it could be that it was a result of some kind of traumatic moment in your life. I've worked with many people that as a result of sexual assault or bullying or violent assault, that belief systems were formed at that time that were designed to keep them safe, that sometimes were even useful in that context, but as they move on in their life, they're still holding on to these belief systems as if they're true, when the need to protect isn't the same because the dynamics and the environment has shifted. If you believe that you're sick, then it has a presupposition that you need to be cured. And generally, when people think about being cured, it's something that happens externally. You take a pill, you have an operation, and that then fixes the problem. If, however, you believe that your brain has learned something which might not be that useful, or it might be believing something that is no longer true or useful, the reason why that's more helpful is that it changes the locus of control from an extrinsic, external factor into an internal factor. So a good therapist doesn't fix you. They don't cure you. They help you fix yourself. And they help you fix yourself by challenging certain belief systems that aren't helpful, accessing resourceful states that you probably have in other areas of your life that you're not applying to the area that you're currently experiencing problems. So one of the key issues of this kind of idea that you're broken is this idea that someone else needs to fix you. However, that is not the case. You could do it yourself, as I did. When I was 19 years old, I had very severe social anxiety. I was a recluse for nearly a year. And, for me, the solution was learn a lot about things like change therapy, psychology, but also it was linked to one key belief system that somehow I was creating this myself. I didn't believe I was sick. I believed that I'd created a situation that wasn't helpful for me, and that belief system helped facilitate that change. So you can do it yourself, but I spent, I don't know, possibly 1,000+ hours thinking and studying in this particular area. In hindsight, what would have been more useful is to find someone that had already developed that level of understanding and had a model of the world that reflected how I perceive things were happening at that time, and then I could have got the results much quicker. Fortunately, by all that study, it's now helped me become a more competent therapist, because I had to work on myself before I even had the intention of working with other people. So you're not fit, you're not broken, and you're not sick. The exception and the caveat here that I would say is that if there is a physical or medical cause of mental health issues, then that's a different situation. So if someone, for example, has been in a car accident and they've had concussion or brain damage and things like that, and that then has linked to a massive change in behavior, that's different because there's a physical link that we can attach to it. If, however, it's been a lifestyle situation, so stress in your life, a phobia that you have, anxiety, or an addiction that you can't get over. And an addiction is a great example of how flawed the medical model works. There are the American Medical Association, various medical boards around the world have diagnosed many addictions, including alcoholism, as a disease. And if you believe it's a disease, then it takes out an element of responsibility of believing that you can change, because you've just been unlucky in life and you've got this disease. So that's why, for me, I'm very much against this kind of blanket belief system that the medical model is the only way of looking at issues regarding health and well-being when it comes to our thoughts, emotions, and such like. And the final thing I wanted to touch on here is that a question that comes up not on every call that I do with a client or a potential client, but there's a question of, am I crazy? And the question, am I crazy, is interesting because it links to this idea of almost like Dickensian England, when they had these kind of very distressing asylums where they would lock people up for their entire life because the doctors didn't know how to help people. So this is this idea of being crazy. But actually, the word crazy is just a subjective evaluation of behavior that is outside of the norm, and the norm being the normal distribution graph. So if you're at the extremities of that, then you're not considered normal, and therefore crazy can be behavior outside of the norm, normally in a detrimental way. So again, why would this term be used within the medical model? And under English law, someone can be sectioned, which is a particular legal process to give the rights, the decision-making rights of that individual over to the state, so that decisions about what medication they have and being confined is entrusted with, let's say, the doctors and the psychiatric wards of hospitals. And in certain cases, I think that is a very, very valid approach. If someone is clearly schizophrenic or suicidal or, has, deep psychosis, then in that context, if they're a danger to themselves or other people, then absolutely, it makes sense that for a short temporary period of time, that they should get at least the ability to be kept safe, safe from themselves and safe from causing harm to other people. However, what can happen, and there's been various studies done over the decades, that when people have pretended to be quote unquote crazy and go into psychiatric establishments almost as a social experiment, and then exhibit none of the symptoms that they had in there, quite often it's very difficult for people to leave these kind of asylums or psychiatric wards of hospitals, because there is almost this kind of, if you think of the Salem witch trials, once someone had decided that a woman was a witch, whatever they did had this confirmation bias that proved that they are a witch. And this can happen if people have an idea that someone is crazy, or you think yourself is crazy. You can look at it through the lens that everything that you do proves that you're crazy. So in some of these studies that have, almost in the form of sociology and social psychology, where people have gone in, when they've said, well, I was just pretending to be mentally ill to do a social experiment, then the psychiatric doctors, the psychiatrists would say, exactly, that's what someone with this particular trait would say. Therefore, it proves that they are still in need of psychiatric attention. And quite often, I don't want to get too deep into politics here, but in the same way that private prisons need prisoners to make money, private psychiatric institutions need patients in order to maintain funding. So sometimes there is a vested interest in the private sector for people not to get better. You've obviously got the other end of the spectrum where in the public sector, there is not the funds to actually look after people who really do need help. And sometimes you see cases of, schizophrenics going on a killing spree with machetes and such like, and they really should be getting the help and the attention that they need. What I'm talking about is 99% of issues that relate to individuals that are dealing with stress and anxiety, phobias, addictions. They're not sick, they're not broken, and they're certainly not crazy. And again, this term crazy has been used throughout history to control people that had ideas that challenged the status quo. So in political environments, that could be a dissident, in different terms. This has been used to kind of almost gaslight people and try and tarnish their credibility by challenging their mental health credentials. So just be aware that this term crazy is a subjective evaluation. You're not going to see a criteria linked to the word crazy that says if you tick these 10 boxes, then you're crazy. It doesn't exist. It's a subjective evaluation. So therefore, when people ask, am I crazy? My question is, what do you think being crazy means? And in many cases, they can't answer the question because they've not really thought about the term crazy. There's just a fear that if they're somehow thinking things that are outside of the norm, then somehow there's something wrong with them. And there's a lot of shame and a huge stigma. There's been great progress, but there's still a lot of shame and a lot of stigma linked to this idea that if you are having things, and by the way, nobody knows all the other things that other people are going through. And as a therapist that's worked with hundreds and hundreds of people, I can tell you, there isn't one person on the planet that doesn't have some form of an issue that they could work on. No one is out there with this magical, perfect mental health. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at all. So therefore, the shame that is linked to this idea of there's something wrong with you, I'm broken, I'm sick, I'm mentally ill, it really has to stop. And I think part of how we can help it to stop is to start thinking of these things as your brain's powerful ability to learn and try and keep you safe that sometimes isn't that useful. I'll give you an example as to a metaphor as to what people will do if their needs aren't being met. If you think of a toddler likes attention. A toddler, I don't know if that's used globally, but here in the UK, it generally refers to a child aged normally about 2 or 3 years old. Now, toddlers at that age have enough awareness of their surroundings and of people that they really crave attention. Now, what can happen is if they get that attention and they get that kind of support and love and connection and affection and all, and someone to play with, they're totally fine. But if a toddler isn't getting that, that need isn't being met. And that's why it's not unusual for toddlers to throw massive tantrums, because they will go to great lengths to get that need of attention. Now, quite often I see this pattern in addictions. I see this pattern in thinking strategies where if the primary way of meeting a need isn't being met, the brain and the mind is so resourceful, it will find a different way of doing it. So, as humans, we need excitement in our life. We need connection. We need to feel important. And if you don't have those things in life, then it's not that surprising that someone could be addicted to a substance if that's their way of connecting with themselves, or a particular drug makes them feel powerful and significant, or if watching endless TV or gambling gives them excitement or drama and those kind of things. Quite often the brain is not broken, it's just more powerful than we think. And if we don't harness that in the right way, then it can look like we're broken, it can look like we're sick, and it can look like we're crazy. But 99.9% of the time, that is not the case. You're not broken, you're not sick, you're not crazy. Your brain just needs a bit of help to move it in the right direction. Sorry if this sounded like a rant. It's not meant to be. It's just my thoughts on a question that's come up time and time again over this last year. It's coming up to the end of the year, so I thought I'd share my thoughts on that. If you're thinking that there's something wrong with you, or that you're sick or broken or crazy or anything like that, there will be a link nearby where you can schedule a free 30-minute consultation call with me, and I can have a chat. And it might be that there's another way of thinking about your particular problem that might be more useful and helpful and create the possibility of positive change. So if you are interested in that, please check out the link, schedule the call with me. It's completely free. Although I talk about working with me in a one-to-one basis, there's no obligation to do that. It's just that normally about half the people that do these calls with me tend to work with me on a one-to-one basis because they have a feeling that I might be able to help them, but there's no obligation or expectation on my side that you do that. I hope this has been useful. If you're listening to this at the time where it's hopefully been broadcast, if I can get Wi-Fi connected to my laptop, then Happy New Year to you, and wishing you a very positive and empowering new year for you. Take care.